What's up, my channel? It's me, your friendly neighborhood sassy blonde writer, here coming at you with another writing video. So today we're going to be talking about, does your story need to have a moral? I recently heard an interesting quote on writing that was, if you want your book to change lives, you need to have an underlying philosophy of the book, and that you need to have a moral of the story. This quote made me very annoyed. A lot of times the moral of a story goes hand in hand with the theme of the story. Now, I've talked about it before here. The theme of the story is something that keeps coming up over and over and over again. It's something repeated throughout the book. It could be something as simple as time management. It could be something the character learns along the way. Theme is something that's repeated throughout the book. It's different from a moral of the story. Most stories need to have a theme. Humans like that. People naturally look for patterns in everything that we do. I'm not going to argue that good stories don't require a theme. And yes, most writers create stories to tell something to the world. My question is, does a story need a moral or a lesson at the end of it to be a good story? Let's take a look. First things first, I do want to say that something that's good or something that's impactful or something that's important is a completely subjective term. And it really annoys me when people talk about it in absolutes, like your story is objectively important. And of course there are objective things that go into it, like grammar, style, that sort of thing. At the end of the day, something that's a good book to me is different from something that's a good book to you. Maybe we have similar tastes and we probably have a good judge of what's not good in something, but at the end of the day, what I personally think is amusing or entertaining is completely different from yours, and that's okay. So my main question here is, does a story need to have a moral in order for it to be considered impactful or a good story to other people? So there needs to be an overall lesson at the end. Now, lesson is different from theme. You need to have a lesson or something that teaches the audience in order to be a good story. Now, my argument here is that no, a good story or an important story does not by any means have to have a lesson or a moral at the end of it. And in fact, it makes me really annoyed that somebody would say that your story doesn't matter if it doesn't have that. So that's the purpose of this video. So this is my argument, that there does not need to be a lesson or a moral at the story for something to be considered good or stand the test of time. We don't need to have a story that has one singular lesson to teach us. People take different things away from stories. There can't be just one singular lesson in them for people to learn, just for them to be impactful. My first example is going to be video games. Most writers, especially on Authortube, don't talk about video games. I think that's not fair. I think they are one of the most underappreciated pieces of art, and it's been that way for far too long, and I'm here to start the conversation about it. But because we can make our own choices in most games, unless they have a very linear plot, then it really isn't an opportunity for them to have just one lesson to teach us. Now, there are exceptions to that. For example, Undertale, one of my favorite games, is an example of something that does really have a singular lesson to teach us, and that is to try to be kind first. That's okay if that's one lesson that you take away from it. However, there are plenty of other video games and other pieces of art out there that are different that way. Now, that is an example of a theme that comes up over and over and over again, but there are other things that come up as well. So a lot of times, because video games, you're a direct participant in what's happening, it's more of an exploration of different themes and ideas than anything else. For example, in the Fallout series, you're dealing with the consequences of your actions in a post-apocalyptic world. You always have the choice, and I think that's really important, is that in a video game you have the ability to choose what you do, and through that you get to explore different themes and ideas. There's no overall moral in Fallout where you have to be nice, you have to do different quests for people, you can't lie, you can't cheat, you can't steal. It's okay if you do that. Fallout just lets you do that and has you live with your choices. That's the overall theme, but it's not the overall message of the story. There's a lot of details that go into the different Fallout games, and it's important to recognize that there are different themes that are made accessible through this media. Another example is Stardew Valley. It's an adorable little game. It's one of my favorites. I play it all the time. I don't want to even think about how many hours I probably sunk into playing that game. And I'm just one of the thousands of people, probably millions of people, who feel that way about it. Is there an overall theme to Stardew Valley? Yes, it's about building community. However, there's not an overall moral to Stardew Valley. There's no lesson that it's trying to teach you or shove down your throat. And that's what makes it such a fun game to play. You get to explore different options and different outcomes, and that's what's fun about it. That's what's fun about video games as well. Ratchet & Clank is another example of having a theme but no overall moral. Ratchet & Clank is actually a critique of capitalism, and it's fascinating to play because it's marketed as like, it looks like a kid's game, but it is actually a very in-depth critique of society and materialism. Is it shoving any opinion about materialism down your throat? No, it's just exploring the idea. Another example is my favorite TV show ever. I talk about it a lot. I'm sorry if you've heard me talk about it before, but it's one of my favorites, so you're gonna deal with it, is Gilmore Girls. Amy Sherman-Palladino has actually famously said she doesn't do themed episodes. Those are from writers that have worked with her. She does not do themed episodes. She tries to write the story like it would happen in life. There's always a structure and there's always a story arc in each episode, but you don't come away from an episode of Gilmore Girls feeling like you learned something. There's no lesson that's being shoved down your throat, and that's what makes it really interesting to watch. It's just a show about a mother and daughter who are best friends and live in a kooky little suburban town. Same can be said about Amy Sherman-Palladino's new show, The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. It's a show about a woman living in the 1950s whose life is turned upside down because her husband is a jerk and left her. The theme is women gaining independence. Is there anything they're shoving down your throat? No, it's a critique of how women were treated in the 1950s. Now, both shows are successful, both shows are really popular, and both shows really resonate with people. Is it because they have this grand overarching theme about love or family? No. In fact, it goes through the complexities of family. Amy Sherman-Palladino never says you should forgive your family no matter what horrible things they do to you, Lorelai. It's more complicated than that, and that's part of the reason why people love it. The reason why both those shows are so popular is because the characters seem realistic, and the story, or not necessarily realistic, but they seem like real, well-rounded people for the most part, and the stories that they are a part of are really compelling, and you're invested in them as characters. That's what makes a story really popular. I have the attention span of a goldfish and zero patience, but I have never been bored watching either of these. I'm convinced that Lorelai Gilmore has also shaped my sense of humor and my way of speaking. I would have fights with my mother or my friends, and I would be able to cope by thinking, okay, if Rory can get through this, I can get through this. That's what makes this type of story impactful or important or considered good. It's because it's got stylistic writing and it's relatable for the audience. It has nothing to do with the overarching theme, and unlike video games, you can't pick and choose what you do. It's all about how relatable in this TV show the characters are. Now, Handmaid's Tale is another example that I'll go into because it's kind of indicative of the dystopian fiction, so I'm doing a case study on this. But Handmaid's Tale, while it's full of lessons and different themes, is not your typical book. It does not follow a typical story structure. As Offred said, it's told in fragments. The main character has no real agency over her life, and normally we like active characters, but that's what's so interesting about reading a book like Handmaid's Tale, or the one that came before it, 1984, that they're passive characters, and that's what's kind of fascinating about them, is they just kind of let things happen to them. Offred has no real agency over herself, which is something completely different from most stories you read nowadays, especially dystopian science fiction, so this is more akin for the older books. If Margaret Atwood had tried to pitch her book to publishers nowadays, they probably would have said no. The trend nowadays is to have a character who's living in a dystopia, they end up fighting it for whatever reason, and it could be forming a small army to take down the government, or it could be something small scale, like finding your family members that went missing or went off to war. In this book, however, Offred doesn't do anything. In fact, she watched her friend Moira try and fail to fight the Republic of Gilead's oppression. She saw her mom, a diehard feminist, get sent to the colonies to clean up toxic waste in a propaganda film. If this was supposed to show any moral or lesson based off of this part of the story, it would be horrifying at face value. Based off of the character's actions, she would basically be telling you, when you're up against an oppressive government, you'll lose. The same can be said for George Orwell's 1984. That's not the point of the story, however. That's not the overall takeaway. There's no overall lesson to the story, but it's still impactful because it's a cautionary tale. Offred in The Handmaid's Tale doesn't have this aha moment where she suddenly becomes an active character. Her story overall is pretty simple and typical for a handmaid in that time period. It's a lot like reading someone's diary, where she's just telling you what's happening and she's really bored most of the time. She's not an active participant in the rebellion or anything like that. There's no overall theme that spells out a single lesson for you, but that's what makes this so impactful. I'd argue the best stories are the ones that have multiple themes and multiple takeaways from them, not just one. So like I was saying, there's no overall theme to The Handmaid's Tale. Instead, she uses the tale of Gilead and Offred as a cautionary tale. Gilead can happen when people don't fight to protect their rights or take their freedoms for granted. Gilead is what could happen if we politicize women's bodies, and Gilead is what happens when we don't have freedom of speech and we are censored. If you talk to anyone who's read the books, you'll see that there are specific themes that she's using, but there's no single universal message of oppression is bad or anything like that. You can't just boil it down to one simple moral. Every single person takes away something slightly different from the story, and that's what makes it great. In fact, that's part of the reason why Margaret Atwood wrote it that way. She created the world of Gilead and uses Offred's narrative as a survivor piece. She didn't base it off of a specific story structure, and though she does use story beats, but she wanted it to work the way real life works. Real life, day to day, there's no moral to your day-to-day life. Do you come back from work one day and just go, well, it's a good thing I got cut off in traffic because I learned patience? No, real life does not work like that. At the end, you find out Offred made these tapes and that they were being played at a historical symposium. Is there an overall moral or lesson in The Handmaid's Tale? No, there's multiple takeaways. Does that mean the book hasn't impacted people's lives or fascinated generation after generation? Absolutely not. In fact, I'd say the complexity of the story is what has made people want to read it. Another example of stories that have stood the test of time are Agatha Christie novels and Sherlock Holmes stories. If you want to learn how to craft a compelling mystery, you absolutely have to read Agatha Christie and Sherlock Holmes. They're compelling to read and to discuss and have been analyzed for decades. There's a whole society in England just dedicated to loving Sherlock Holmes. However, there's never a single takeaway. What makes these compelling to read are the use of theme and the suspense and the tension in the story. It's never an overall theme of blah 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 did something wrong. It's never that simple, and that's what's so interesting about it. The point is, there's more complexities than just one single moral in the story. So what can we take away from this discussion? That it's not necessarily the presence of a moral or a lesson that makes a story great or stand the test of time or impact lives. It's a matter of themes that resonate with people, and you can have multiple themes in your book. You probably will, regardless of whether you meant to or not. That's just the way people are wired. Characters that charm or interest you or are relatable to the reader. That will make people compelled to read or watch it. Plots with intrigue that make you curious about what's going to happen next, like your Sherlock Holmes and your Agatha Christie books, and relatability. There should always be some part of your story that people can relate to, whether it's a character's sense of humor, a problem in the plot that you've gone through yourself, that sort of thing. Those are my arguments for why you don't need to have a moral of your story, and that there's more things that make stories to stand the test of time than just a lesson. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please hit that like button. If you have some ideas or would like to counter argue, please be respectful in the comments. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you liked it, please like and subscribe. I post new videos 1 to 2 times a week, and of course, happy writing.